The next speaker is Professor Joëlle Rüegg, who is now going to talk about the key topic in the area of EDCs, which is currently debated in the more technical committees of the European Commission, namely mixtures of chemicals and their impact on our health and well-being. So I would like to welcome you. You're already here on the stage. That's very good. So we can quickly move on. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the introduction. And now I'm going a bit back to the more sober scientific language. But I hope that I will leave you with some feelings. And I have a slide at the end, which is a concrete suggestion, at least. So I will talk about mixtures, and I have this first slide, which really illustrates what has been already said this morning, that we are exposed to these over 1,000 chemicals that are potential or known EDCs, i.e. they are working in similar ways on our bodies, and we have all these different sources of exposure. And we saw this morning also, we have all these chemicals in our bodies. And that really means that real-life exposure, this entails mixture of chemicals. And we can address this issue in different ways. I have brought an example from a study in Sweden, the SELMA study, which is based in Värmland. It's a population-based study, normally exposed population. The PI of this study is Carl Gustav Bornehag at Karlstad University, and the main aim of this study is to address the question how prenatal exposures shape health and development during the lifespan. Now the kids are around 15 years old. There have been different investigations in different health domains, such as sexual development, metabolism and growth, and then also neurodevelopment, which I will focus on. And here a first example on what we could learn from the SELMA study, for example, that the EDC mixtures are associated with a lower IQ. This is data based on the SELMA study and the prenatal exposure to EDCs and the IQ measurements at 7 years. And now I'll show you a bit of a busy figure here. You basically see all of the analytes in the on the x-axis, and with biostatistical methods where mixture exposure is taken into account, we can make associations. So one conclusion was that yes, a mixture of these EDCs is associated with lower IQ, but also you can see here that what is above this black threshold is actually the chemicals that drive these associations. And what you can see here, for example, is the highest associated chemical is bisphenol F. And this shows you something that has been illustrated this morning as well, that these substitutes for example, BPA, resulting in this BPA-free, less toxic products can actually contain chemicals that are even more worrisome. So this is one example, and of course, we've heard this morning already, these are observations, these are associations in human data. And some criticism could always be that, well, maybe there are confounders in these associations which we're simply not controlling for. And thus, for us, it has become very important to integrate the epidemiological evidence with experimental studies. And I wanted to show you one example where we did that in a previous Horizon 2020 project, the EDC Mixed Risk project, where we integrated epidemiology, experimental toxicology, and also developed a risk assessment approach for mixture to relate back what we find in the experimental research back to human exposure. So the principle is outlined here. We identified, just as you showed you before with this mixture analysis in human data, so-called bad actors, chemicals that were associated with different health outcomes. We then went to the lab and really synthesized these mixtures and tested them in different cell and animal models. And then with an approach that was developed in this project, the sufficient similarity approach, or SMAC, we could relate the results back to human exposure. So the example here is what we call the mixture N, the N for neurodevelopment. This is a mixture which is associated with language delay at 30 months of age. And so language delay is an early marker for impaired neurodevelopment. It's strongly correlated with IQ in the SELMA study, but also in other studies. And of course, language development is also often impaired in other disorders than such as autism spectrum disorder. And here is the composition of this mixture N. You see here a number of phthalates and then bisphenol A and some of the perfluorinated compounds. And we based the composition of the mixture then on the measurements we had in the SELMA mothers. So basically on the geometric mean that were measured in the SELMA mothers. We tested the mixture in concentrations that were relevant to the human exposure. And here is a summary of what we found in the experimental models. We used, for example, organoids that were also introduced this morning, brain organoids this time that can mimic some early important key processes of neurodevelopment in humans. Here we looked, among others, on the transcription of genes, the gene expression, and the interesting thing was that we could find at low concentrations that genes were changed that are causally linked to neurodevelopmental disorders, for example, autism spectrum disorder. We also found that there that they are disturbing endocrine signaling, of course, and in particular thyroid hormone signaling in the cell models and also in frog, tadpoles, and in zebrafish. And on top of this, we could link this to changed behaviors in the animal models. All of these effects were seen, as I said before, at concentrations close to human levels. So this was very important to validate the findings we had in humans. We could really show this in low concentration, there were effects. But of course, this is just a mixture out of infinite ones. So not even in the SELMA mother, in the SELMA study, we have mothers that are exactly exposed to this reference mixture. So to kind of relate back what we found in terms of levels of concern, in terms of concentrations in the experimental data, our colleague in New York, Chris Jennings, developed an approach to compare the reference mixture to the real-life exposures by using the principle of sufficient similarity. This is mathematical modeling, which I cannot in detail explain to you, but the principle is that you use the variation in the experimental data and say, like, how far can you go from this reference mixture to still compare levels? And so this is what she did. So she went back to the SELMA women and looked at their mixtures and asked the question, how many of the women were exposed to the mixture that is sufficiently similar to mix N, to this reference mixture. And of course, it was many of these women, 96%, because the reference mixture came from the SELMA mothers. But then also, sorry, I give away the answers already because the animation doesn't work properly. But anyway, so the next question was then, of these women, how many are exposed to levels of concern based on the experimental data? And you can see it already on the slide. So it was over 50% of the SELMA women that had exposure levels above concern. And this, keeping in mind that, again, this is a normally exposed population, and for all of these single compounds, the regulatory levels were far below the regulatory values, but apart from the BPA, of course, which has been now reduced a lot. So in conclusion, I showed you an example that prenatal exposure to mixtures of EDCs is associated with neurodevelopmental outcomes. For example, low IQ in these Swedish children. Mixture N, which is associated with language delay, could showed effects in experimental system at concentrations that were close to the human levels. And with this SMAC approach, we can actually link then the experimental findings back to human exposure, and we found that there was a concern for over 50% of the SELMA women. So basically, mixtures matter. That is the main conclusion from this EDC mixers project. And the problem is, of course, that these mixtures are already in the women. So what can we do prospectively? What can we do to avoid these soups of harmful exposures? And here a concrete advice, a mixture assessment factor would be a first pragmatic step to take the mixture issue into account. And we can hopefully discuss a bit more about this at the panel discussion. But now I want to thank you and the consortium, and thanks for the attention.
Thank you so much.